All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Ornaments Refracted Cosmologies Colloquium. This colloquium is brought to you by the Yale School of Architecture, the Franke Program in Science and the Humanities, and the Macmillan Center at Yale. Last week, we had an incredible turnout for Professor Ken Plumer's talk on the language of ornament and an abundance of great questions. So thank you all to those of you who attended and participated. If you missed last week's talk, you're in luck because we recorded the event and it will be posted at the Yale School of Architecture's YouTube channel, as well as our colloquium event page. As a reminder, today's event will be followed by our last talk on making ornaments on Monday, April 26th at 6:30. We hope you can attend as well. Now, we welcome you to today's talk on Ornament and Neuroscience with Nikos, Salingaros, and Richard Taylor. We are your hosts and moderators. I am Cassandra Leipa, Yale School of Architecture class of 2019. I'm a visual artist and architectural designer and work at Centerbrook Architects. I first encountered ornament when taking Ken's course at Yale and became infatuated with the ways in which the field of ornament bridges across boundaries between diverse disciplines as we are seeing today.
And I'm Misha Semyonov. I'm also Yale School of Architecture class of 2019, as well as School of the Environment. And I'm also at Centerbrook Architects, where I get to sneak some ornament into my work here and there. It's always exciting. The relationship of ornament to biophilia and our brain's need for natural patterns has long been a really big interest for me. And that's why today's lecture is something I've really been looking forward to. I've actually been looking forward to it for 1.5 years since we started planning it. It got postponed by the pandemic, but here we are on Zoom, and I'm really excited for this conversation. I hope you all are as well. A quick note for participants, please do keep yourselves muted while Richard and Nikos are presenting to us. We do hope we'll have a lively discussion following their talks. Rather than everybody jumping in, please do type your questions and thoughts in the chat, and then we'll ask you to unmute one by one so you can ask your questions. If you prefer that we read your questions out loud, you can indicate that as well. You can always chat us during at any point, and we'll try and get any concerns resolved. I also wanted to encourage everybody to get in touch with us. If you have any questions, if you want follow-up links to the event footage, etc., just go to yaleornament.wordpress.com. There's a contact us button there, and you can get in touch with us that way.
Yeah, we're very responsive.
So now it's our great pleasure to introduce to you our two guest speakers, Professor Richard Taylor, Professor Nikos Salingaros.
All right. So Dr. Richard Taylor is the head of the physics department at the University of Oregon. He studied physics at the University of Nottingham in the UK and received a degree in art theory from the Manchester School of Art. He has taught and conducted research in the US, Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, the Netherlands, and Japan. Richard's list of accomplishments is extraordinarily long, so this intro will not do him justice. He has authored many publications ranging from books, book chapters, peer-reviewed articles, and contributions to journals such as Nature, The New Scientist, The Scientific American. Through his cutting-edge research, Richard inhabits a unique niche within the intersection of physics, art, and psychology. His research addresses the fundamental questions about fractals, and to quote him, his, quote, main projects focus on applying the concept of bioinspiration to nanoscience, visual science, and visual art, and feature an interplay between the fundamental and applied research. From research on designing retinal implants to use fractal sensors to better integrate into the human body, to understanding the fractal nature of human-made art, Richard's contributions are literally changing how we see the world.
And following him, Dr. Nikos Salingaros is a professor of mathematics at the University of Texas in San Antonio, as well as an urbanist and architectural theorist. He's taught in the United States, the Netherlands, Italy, Mexico, and more. Dr. Salingaros has a truly extensive list of publications on the intersection between mathematics and architecture and urbanism. Dr. Salingaros' background in mathematics has allowed him to position himself as an architectural theorist while seamlessly referencing mathematical properties and theories. He was one of architect Christopher Alexander's closest collaborators. He's championed the use of rigorous scientific analysis and human intuitive experience in conjunction as an approach to design buildings and communities that are more adaptive to human needs. Nikos has written extensively about incorporating fractals in design and the importance of scaling and ultimately ornament in the built environment. So thank you, Richard. Thank you, Nikos, for being with us here virtually. We were going to now hand it over to Richard to get us started.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, can people see my screen? Perfect. All right, so yeah, thank you for the invite. It's a great privilege. It's a beautiful day here on the West Coast. And it's a privilege also to do the warm-up act for my good friend Nikos, who has been a big inspiration for me. So let's start off with this image of nature, right? And there's no doubt that nature's beauty is profound. You have to go a long way to find somebody who finds nature ugly. And of course, this profound nature gets to the movement that Misha mentioned, that biophilia, this idea that humans have this intrinsic need to be connected to nature. And there are lots of pioneering psychology experiments that have looked at how profound the impact of nature is when you look out on a scene like this. So some experiments have shown how it radically reduces your stress levels. Others have shown how it reduces mental fatigue. The level of impact, positive impact on humans then raises the question, well, what is it about looking out on this scene that is delivering all of these amazing things? Is there even a pattern in nature, and what is that? So that's what I want to concentrate on with my few slides, is addressing that question. When we talk about nature, what is the fingerprint pattern of nature? And then I want to talk to you about a few experiments showing about how that pattern influences the impact on a person. So if we ask that question, well, what do we know about patterns in nature? Let me just click that. Yeah, so we have to go back to the 1860s when mathematicians started to look at patterns that repeat at different size scales. And you can see this in this triangle, which is named after Sierpinski. So you can see what's happened here is that a triangle is repeated at different size scales in this sort of careful layering process. And the mathematicians were interested in the visual complexity that it created. And so they were so enamored with this careful layering process to generate complexity that they thought that they'd actually outdone nature. They thought that their beautiful triangles and whatever shapes that they did had nothing to do with nature, and actually referred to their patterns as being pathological. They would look at one of nature's images. So for example, on the right, this is a view of a coastline, and they'd recognize that nature's stimuli were complicated, but they felt that that complexity just resulted from a haphazard nonsense. They didn't think that nature had any underlying pattern to it. And like I said, they celebrated their careful patterning to generate complexity and really didn't think too much about nature. And it took a mathematician called Lewis Fry Richardson to actually check it out and look at coastlines and see where that complexity came from. And Lewis Fry Richardson did something very unwise. He actually died, and even more unwise than that, he died before he told people what he'd actually found. And so it actually took another mathematician who ended up in Yale to actually promote what Lewis Fry Richardson had actually found. Oops. So Mandelbrot, almost 100 years later from when the mathematicians started in the 60s and 70s, eventually published this book called The Fractal Geometry of Nature. And we'll talk about what the word fractal means in a minute. But in essence, this is what he found. So if we look at trees, for example, on the left-hand side, we see a sort of artificial representation of a tree that you zoom in at different size scales and a pattern keeps on repeating. And this is a sort of careful layering that the mathematicians were interested in. Mandelbrot found that the same thing was going on in nature. So if we look at the right-hand column, that's an example of a natural tree. Now, of course, as we all know, in nature, there's a lot of randomness, and nature throws in this randomness. And so it disrupts the exact repetition of the pattern, so that all that you get is a repetition of the general qualities, what we call the statistical qualities of the pattern. And this is where the word self-similarity comes from, that a tree is self-similar. It looks just similar at different size scales. So Mandelbrot was celebrated because he kind of united the two types of patterns, the early, what are called exact fractals, and the statistical fractals that we find in nature. And he used fractal as an umbrella term. Now, where fractal comes from is that Mandelbrot noticed that all of these repeating patterns generated a very fractured surface, particularly when compared to smooth Euclidean patterns like circles and squares. And so he focused in on this word fracture, and he knew that Latin for fracture was fractus. He didn't quite like the sound of the word fractus, so he converted it to fractal, and that word stuck. So both of these categories are called fractals. And you can actually see this in this picture here, that the top pattern is an exact fractal, so very artificial and mathematical looking. You gradually mix in some randomness into it, and at the bottom you convert it into a statistical fractal that very much looks like a coastline. So exact fractals are very rare in nature because there's so much randomness in nature. So a few examples are a snowflake. If you look at the center there, you can see on the left, you can see a pattern with sort of 6 spokes, and then it's repeated itself at a larger scale. And another example of an exact fractal in nature is broccoli, but they're very rare. In nature, you tend to get statistical fractals. So very common examples from everyday life. Trees are statistical fractal. The way that their branches repeat at different size scales are very similar. Mountains are fractal, so you've got big peaks. Zoom in on those and you'll see smaller peaks. Zoom in on those, you'll see smaller peaks. Rivers are fractal. You have big tributaries branching into smaller and smaller ones. And clouds are fractal. So they're so prevalent in nature that some people refer to them as the fingerprint of nature. So when we look out on a scene then, what we're seeing is a whole sort of cascade of fractal patterns. You've got the clouds in the sky, you've got the mountains, you've got all of the bushes, you've got the ripples in the water. So all of these fractals are flooding into your visual system. And this is what made us propose this idea that we call fractal fluency, that through evolution that we've been surrounded by these fractal patterns. And so our visual systems have become fluent in the visual language of fractals. And we can see that at different levels of our visual system, all the way from the way that the eye looks at fractal patterns through to the way that the brain processes the images. So for example, we've done eye tracking experiments, and we find that the way that your eye moves when it looks at a fractal pattern actually traces out a fractal trajectory. And you can see that in this top picture. So what you've got is lots of long jumps mixed in with smaller and smaller and smaller jumps. And that's a very, very efficient way of your eye to actually search through the fractal scenery and acquire all of that visual information. Then, of course, you've got to process the information. And so we're studying the brain using techniques such as EEG and fMRI to see how the brain is actually now understanding what it is actually seeing. And I want to emphasize that these processes are all unfolding on the millisecond level, and they're all automatic before we even have sort of conscious deliberation. So they're all sort of automatic processes beyond our sort of conscious thought. And that's where the word sort of neuroaesthetics comes from. So fractals are naturally very complex things because of all of this layering of patterns at different size scales. But some fractals are more complex than others. And it's all to do with the levels of fine scale versus coarse scale patterns that go into this fractal mix. Things that have a lot more fine structure look very rich and intricate, and they're very complex. Things that are very sparse and open look less complex. And you can see this with three common examples. So clouds have low visual complexity, cracks in the mud have mid complexity, trees in the forest have high complexity. And we can measure this with a mathematical parameter called D, and that lies on a scale between 1 and 2. Closer to 1 is simple, closer to 2 is complex. And so you can see that here. The simple clouds have a D value of 1.3. The kind of the rich trees in the forest have a D value very close to 2. And we've done behavioral experiments where we put images on the screen and get people to rate them. And this has shown that the way that people perceive the complexity actually goes in hand with the mathematical complexity. So this complexity really is driving the sort of visual appearance of the fractals. So here's a couple of examples. The clouds in the upper image you can see has got lots of fine structure, so that will be a high D fractal. The one in the lower picture has got less fine structure, and so that's a much lower complexity. Trees in the summer and winter, when the trees shed their leaves, it reveals all of that rich twigs behind the leaves, and that increases the complexity. So the high D, sorry, the top image has a D value probably around about 1.3. The lower one has a D value of 1.7. Now, if we look at prevalent patterns in nature, so there's lots of fractals out there, but the most prevalent ones have mid-D complexity, around about 1.3 to 1.4. So the fractal fluency model says that those are the ones that through evolution, we have actually, our visual systems have adapted to process almost effortlessly. And we should see all sorts of interesting things unfold when we look at fractals with mid-D complexity. So for example, in our studies, we've looked at sort of detection sensitivity, where we show an image on a screen, and then we gradually reduce the contrast. So we start off with a black and white image, make it grayer and grayer and grayer, and we keep on checking in with the person and seeing if they can still detect the fractal. And we find that fractals with mid-D, they can see the images far more further along in that process, showing that the visual system finds it very easy to detect these mid-D fractals. And the same with discriminating fractals. We can do little subtle changes to the fractals, and we find those changes to be far more easy to spot for mid-D fractals because our visual systems have adapted to process them and understand them relatively easy. We've even done navigation sort of experiments where we get an avatar to walk around a fractal scene of different D values and find people can navigate through fractal scenes far more effectively if it's got this mid-D sort of range to it. Sometimes we're so good at this that we get trigger happy. So for example, we've all seen these percepts of images. For example, here, a dog. Looking at a cloud, you can actually see this perception of the dog. Now, the dog is not there. And what's happening is that these clouds have a mid-D value to them. And we're so sort of, our pattern recognition skills are so sort of primed up to look at them that we actually see patterns that are not actually there. We've also done analysis of the infamous Rorschach ink blots, and they've actually got fractal edges. And it's that mid-D fractality that is causing those blots to be so effective in terms of seeing perceptions of images that aren't there. And in the bottom image, we've used a sort of technique where we've removed all of the fractal character from the edges. And I think you can see that the number of images actually drop off. So all of these experiments demonstrate that our abilities, our sort of abilities to do visual tasks get heightened when we look at these mid-D fractals, simply because through evolution, in a way, we've become hardwired to actually look at these things. And these are the things that we want to actually look at. So the big question then is, does this usher in a feeling of aesthetics? So we've done lots of behavioral experiments where we've shown people images of different D values, and people always prefer these mid-D complexity fractals. We've also done experiments on measuring people's relaxation. So one way you can do this is by looking at skin conductance, that when you get stressed out, your skin conductance actually changes. Another way is to look at EEG, like with this little baby here, you put lots of electrodes on the head and you look at these signals called alpha waves, and they peak when you're relaxed. And these experiments show that when you look at these mid-D fractals, not only do you rate them as being aesthetic, but it ushers in this profound feeling of relaxation. It actually reduces your stress levels by up to 60%, which is quite a powerful amount for just looking at a fractal image. And these experiments, many of the early experiments were actually sponsored by NASA because they wanted to keep the astronaut stress level free, you know, when they're floating around in space. But what about the rest of us who are stuck on Earth? You know, we get stressed as well. And in particular, you know, the United States wastes about $300 to $600 billion each year on stress-related illnesses. So this then raises the question, can scientists collaborate with designers and architects to design fractal patterns in everyday working and living spaces that can actually reduce your stress levels? Now, no great surprise really. If what we've got are these natural fractal detectors in our eyes, then you'd expect that artists have actually been creating these fractals over many centuries, and that turns out to be true. So here I'm actually showing you 6 images, and 5 of them are of natural fractals, and one of them is actually produced by one of our great American artists, Jackson Pollock. And you actually have to look fairly carefully to spot the Pollock from the natural ones. And it's actually the middle one in the left column that is a Jackson Pollock painting. So we did, so maybe just a little bit about Jackson Pollock. So he reached his peak in the late 40s, early 50s. He laid a canvas out on the floor of his studio and he poured paint directly to build these huge abstract patterns. And we used the computer program. So we didn't really do anything clever. We just used the computer programs that scientists have been using to analyze the fractals in nature and applied it to Jackson Pollock's work and found that his great poured paintings were just as fractal as any fractal in nature. And you can see that here, where we've compared it to sort of trees in the forest. And that art movement was originally referred to as abstract expressionism, and we renamed it as fractal expressionism. So Pollock became really skilled at generating fractals. He took 10 years manipulating the process. And just like in nature, where nature can produce lots of different D values, Pollock's paintings have lots of different D values. But what's really interesting is looking at how things evolved through his career. So plotted on the bottom of this graph is the year in which he painted the painting. So spanning from 1943 all the way up to 1952. And then on the y-axis is the D value of paintings that he produced during that year. You can see that he started off with very simple, sparse fractals with D values 1.1. Then he went up to around about 1.7 in 1950. He overshot briefly and went up to 1.9, decided that he didn't like that and scaled down to 1.7. Now, I think what's interesting about this slide from today's point of view discussion is that notice how he swept right through the aesthetics related to neuroscience. So if he was really governed by all of the automatic processes that I've been talking about, he would have painted fractal patterns round about 1.3 to 1.5. Instead, he kept on going to 1.7. And I think that that emphasizes the kind of interest when we talk about aesthetics, that an awful lot of our aesthetics is driven by this neuroaesthetics, by these automatic processes that unfold before we've even thought about the painting. But we're not victims to that neuroaesthetics. We also have all of our sort of cultural and historical and emotional impacts that can furthermore add to the aesthetics. And so I see aesthetics as this great sort of visual game where we're balancing all of our biological processes with all of our sort of cognitive processes. Now, of course, if we've all got these great fractal detectors in our eyes, then lots of artists should have been doing this. And indeed, just a few examples from the past. So Leonardo da Vinci, his sketch of what's called the deluge from 1500. If you look closely at the top left, you can see swirls within swirls within swirls. So he clearly saw the repeating patterns of nature and actually put them on a canvas. Another famous artist is the Dutch graphic designer Mork Escher. And he actually had to collaborate with a Canadian mathematician called Coxeter to actually embed his repeating patterns onto his designs. So his designs are a great sort of combination of art and science. I just want to mention a few projects that I've been working on. So I've been collaborating with one of the world's largest carpet manufacturers called Mohawk. And we've chosen carpets because they offer one of the large areas in a room. And the idea is, can we embed stress-reducing fractals into the carpets to kind of relax people? And these designs are sort of part scientific, but we worked with Austrian designers, a design company called 9 and 13. And these are actually called relaxing floors because they're designed to exactly do this, to actually relax you when you look at them. Also working with 13 and 9 Design, and Anna and Martin of 13 and 9, they are designing using exactly the same patterns that this beautiful chapel in a state hospital in Austria. And so the light is shining in, casting all of these shadows through the wall pattern. You could also think about putting fractal patterns on window shades to actually cast fractal patterns into the room. And we're working with a company called Fact Design now, where we're actually developing noise reducing ceilings and actually embossing fractal patterns in the ceilings. So they both reduce your stress levels when you look at them and reduce noise levels. So the sort of multifunction. And another example is that we've been designing fractal solar panels, which are just as electrically efficient as the sort of horrible Euclidean, what they call bus bars on the left-hand side. So these two have exactly the same electrical efficiency, but our studies show that the aesthetics of the fractal solar panels are much more than the sort of horrible Euclidean ones. So just these few projects really celebrate what has been going on through the centuries, where across many centuries, across many continents, artists have been developing these patterns, what we could call ornaments. And so I'm not talking about anything new here. I'm just sort of celebrating things. So just with these few slides then, I've kind of introduced fractals and how we respond to nature's fractals. But of course, we want to do bio-inspiration. We don't want to just copy nature. We want to learn from it and then adapt it and incorporate it into the artificial world, and in particular into ornaments. And that's where Nikos's skill set comes in, about how do you learn from all of these things and develop artificial fractals for our living and working spaces. And so with that, I will actually stop sharing and hand over to Nikos.
Thank you, Richard. I'm beginning my talk now. And this is what I will cover. First, the fractals and the distribution of sizes. And then I will go to eye tracking and the subliminal reality that is revealed by eye tracking. Third is biophilia, which Richard has already mentioned, the love of life and living structure. And then Christopher Alexander and his 15 geometrical properties, which anticipated much of the stuff we're discovering today. And finally, creating ornament for today. So to begin with, here is a similarity, not as pretty as the trees that Richard showed, but just rectangles, and we enlarge them, and they're similar, okay? And we're going to make fractals out of this. But before doing that, I have to talk about the distribution of sizes, because we have a special distribution in fractals that obey some sort of inverse power law, namely the smaller a piece is, the smaller an element piece, the more copies of it, of that size are present. So all fractals obey this rule. And now we can see more architecture-oriented pieces. We have similar pieces because they're magnified, but we also have the distribution of sizes where the smaller pieces are more numerous. And we're going to put these together. Let me introduce some terms in a very confused topic. You may not know these terms, but they help to create order. Accretive fractals add smaller and smaller pieces recursively. Perforated fractals are what you expect. You cut holes in something, smaller and smaller holes. And as Richard already described, in nature, we have some randomness. So we have statistical similarity where you don't have perfect fractals. So we need to watch out for all of these. So here is a fractal that on purpose I create from a semicircle. So it doesn't have any jagged edges like the Mandelbrot fractals. Okay, so when you touch it with your finger, it doesn't, jab you. So what are we doing? We're adding smaller and smaller semicircles, and you're getting some vaguely organic shape, right? Like the cauliflower or the broccoli flower. We're adding smaller and smaller copies. And here is the different type of fractal, which is the perforated. You keep punching smaller and smaller semicircles, and you keep going down, and you make some sort of sieve, and you can go and fill in the middle there and cut a smaller sieve. So what is the, what do we get from this? Well, in the fractals, the smaller pieces are similar to the larger pieces, so that after you magnify them, they look more or less the same. So this is for more perfect fractals. Why do we like perfect fractals? Well, because of the magic word fluency, processing fluency that Richard mentioned. The brain processes recursive patterns much faster than non-recursive ones from the theory of information. And this has been verified in fMRI scans. So this is a huge survival advantage, because if we can process information about our environment, the animal that processes faster can escape the predator faster and lives to pass on his genes. Now, here is a statistical fractal where the complex structure does not have self-similarity. And I have on purpose chosen an architectural fractal. So we take something, we magnify it, we see that there's something vaguely resembling, but it's not just a magnification of a single pattern. And we keep magnifying, but there is stuff there. Okay, so I think of Louis Sullivan. You keep magnifying, and there is interesting, complex stuff there. At this point, we need to add something beyond fractals, because we seek deep symmetry. On the one hand, we have the fractals that ties different scales together into something that has complex structure on every scale. However, we also need organized complexity that uses multiple symmetries to hold the form together. And this is more so in animals and in human creations than in nature, which is overwhelmingly plant life. The plant life have their own subtle symmetries, but not the obvious symmetries. that we humans create and crave. So let me just review in a few seconds. We have translational symmetry, where something goes in one direction and repeats in an ordered line. We have rotational symmetry, where something rotates and repeats. And then we have bilateral symmetry or reflectional symmetry, where you have a reflection across an axis. And here is the first conclusion slide. Suppressing ornament destroys a fractal, because the ornament is going to be the smallest scales of a fractal. The smallest scales of a fractal, and the fractal is encompassing the entire building. If that building is designed in a special way to appeal to the evolved human senses. So without ornament, architecture undermines human cognition by denying the brain and the human body the ordered basis, which are the smaller sizes. Now, subliminal reality is going to come in, and we're going to have an experimental technique to prove the outrageous statement that I just made. The human brain and the human body crave visual contrast, curves, detail, and edges. They engage our attention, and we evolved in order to engage our attention for survival. And we just don't see plainness, because plainness gives us no information, and therefore we have better things to do to watch out for snakes or for tigers than to stare at something that has no information. So here is an award-winning art museum, and I'm going to use eye tracking, in fact, eye tracking software, to show that this is invisible to our unconscious, despite the architectural award. Here is the eye tracking. This is VAS, 3M's visual attention software, that shows where the eye looks at for the first 3 to 5 seconds. This is totally unconscious. You cannot force yourself to look at this. This is where you look, and this is independent of culture, of race, of age, of anything. So look, nobody looks at the building or at the facade. Everyone looks at the corners. Therefore, this building is invisible. Now, to make the building noticeable, we add ornament. Everyone knows that, or used to know that before general amnesia. What is the VAS tracking? Well, here it is. The building has become visible through ornament. Now, this is the first 3 to 5 seconds. After the first 3 to 5 seconds, you can force yourself to look at something and say, oh, this is wonderfully minimalistic. The architect won the Pritzker Prize. Okay, you force yourself, but the first 3 to 5 seconds don't lie. So is the point of architecture to build structures that we do not see? The eye tracking shows us the subliminal reality. It reveals how a building will influence us in a most unexpected way. And without ornament, a structure is disconnected from spontaneous human cognition, and you have to wait until the unconscious reaction is over, and then force yourself to look at that building and pay attention to the building. And what does that do to the human brain? It causes stress. It causes stress to the body. No wonder we're living in a stressful world. Okay, but that's beyond this talk. So I'm collaborating with Anne Sussman to do this eye tracking. We have one publication. Anne Sussman has written the classic book, Cognitive Architecture, which is now going to be in its second edition. So I strongly recommend that, and we have a big program, research program. Now, turn the page. We go to biophilia. Biophilia is our evolved love of life and living structure, and is due to the psychologist Erich Fromm and the biologist Edward Wilson. And biophilic design, which is what is really relevant to architecture, was developed by Yale's own, the late Stephen Kellert. And we have actually developed a numerical measure for the Biophilic Healing Index. So let's look at this. One of the biophilic indices is fractals. Okay, but then we have something that's not fractals, but equally as important. We have color, which is contrasting and harmonious and intense color, And we have curves on different scales. Remember, we have fractals, so we have to have stuff on different scales. We have details. Those are the smallest levels of a fractal. If you don't have details, you don't have a fractal. You have representations of nature, namely a painting, sculptures, ornament with leaves, and then you have organized complexity, which is a whole hour's talk, where you have multiple symmetries that don't necessarily look like nature, but it's sort of like the Islamic decoration and all the wonderful ornamentation that we have throughout history that doesn't explicitly look like a natural thing, but yet the brain perceives this as organized because of the information content. So we can compute the Biophilic Healing Index, but this page is on the web for anyone who's interested. At the moment, biophilia is being discussed in architectural circles, and architects are saying we are producing a biophilic building. However, there's tremendous confusion because there is a simplistic statement that biophilia represents being surrounded by animals and plants. Well, that's one of the factors. There are in fact 10 factors, and one of them is fractals, which is what we're discussing today. So when you read about biophilic design, please be careful to read the context to see that the person who's discussing it knows about all the different factors and is not just talking about being surrounded by animals and plants. Therefore, according to these experimental results, the ornament has to grow out of biophilia, which is the love of life. Even if the ornament is abstract, like Islamic ornament and much other ornament, it has to grow out of love of life, because that's where biophilia comes from, our neural system, which is wired through our evolution. So a question, difficult question, why is most new ornament dead? Because we've had a century-old hatred of the complexity of the geometry of life, with designers and architects trying to get as far away from a living type of structure as possible. So it's very difficult after you've been conditioned to hate something to create it very nicely. And we have several exceptions. I note here Ken Bloomer, who's with us, a great honor, Christopher Alexander, a few buildings, and tens of thousands of buildings built by unknown architects today in very poor conditions throughout the world, which you never see in the architectural journals. They create wonderful ornament with color and with fractals, and nobody has taught them anything. It is just the biological nature expressing itself if you don't suppress it with silly theories about ornament. Okay, so to get back to the Biophilic Healing Index, if you remove some of the elements of the Biophilic Healing Index, what does it do? Well, if you remove these, including fractals, you limit it to at most 40%, and even that is an optimistic statement. Certain design styles really put a ceiling on the healing effects that certain buildings will have to the users, short-term and long-term. And if you remove the vertical axis, which is very fashionable nowadays, you further reduce that to 30% maximum. This is what we're doing. Wake up, architectural world. The vertical reference axis is necessary for reasons of physics and biology, because ambulation uses gravity to move the body forward. In fact, when we walk, we fall forward, and we use the vertical axis. Eye scan gives you a totally different evidence, because we scan the scene horizontally. Now, this is animals. Plants don't care about that, but the brain processes stimuli much faster around the vertical axis, and psychologists know this as the oblique effect. You put something oblique, and it takes much, much longer for the brain to get information rather than something that's symmetrical about the vertical axis. Going further into the brain, our evolution has specific cells that recognize the bilateral symmetries of an upright face. And for this, I recommend Anne Sussman's book and Justin Hollander on cognitive design. the human perception is tuned to engage people because, say, for the last million years, our evolution has been driven not so much by engaging with nature, but by engaging with other people, because other people were our best friends and also our worst enemies. So we are tuned to faces, and faces have very specific bilateral patterns, and we have to examine the details of the faces. So here we have to look at this, and you have to decide in a few milliseconds based on details of the expression what's going to happen. And if you are not fast enough, then you get eaten. So our brain is really hardwired for ornament. We have the bilateral symmetries of faces. We have ordered detail needed for the survival. We have the fractal scaling imprinted from evolution, plus the other biophilic elements together create ornament. Going further, ornament is a manifestation of animal intelligence. We have examples of wonderful architecture of animals, birds and fish that build things. I'm not referring to ornamentation on the body because that's genetic. Okay, that's a separate mechanism. I'm talking to the animal actually picking up things and building something around its nest. And so you say bees and termites are not very intelligent. Yes, they build sophisticated structures, but they don't do this consciously. It's a sort of the social insects and the building process is driven more by the physics, whereas the octopus, which is almost as intelligent as we are, picks up rocks and builds the garden around the house. And those of us of our generation, Richard and I, we know the Beatles song about the octopus's garden. How about environment for children? Do children need ornament and symmetry? I'm afraid here things are getting very serious. Experiments with mice and fish show that developing in a minimalist environment, the brain has a much smaller mass than the control. The intelligent part of the brain becomes insufficiently wired. These are frightening results, but these are 15-year-old results, and results like this are accumulating. Michael and I published an article, Michael Mchaffy and I, 9 years ago. Well, no one has paid any attention to it, perhaps because it was published in an architecture magazine. But you know, this is an alarm bell going on, what the environment is doing to our children. But that's a different talk, okay? So back to this talk, I want to cover Christopher Alexander's work, who is the pioneer of pattern languages and who revolutionized computer software. And he initiated a mathematical and scientific approach to design. He gave tools for building up subliminal reality and building up structures that respond very positively to the human mind and the human body. So strongly recommend The Nature of Order. It's in 4 volumes. What I'm talking about today is contained in book 1, and then I've used my textbook for architecture courses, Unified Architectural Theory, and most of those chapters are free online of my book and not of Christopher's book. So here are 7 of the 15 properties that he gave as guidelines in order to create a living structure that really connects with individuals. And the first one is levels of scale, which is really fractals. So unfortunately, he did not call it fractals, so we have 2 separate names, but it's for the same thing. And then he gives strong centers, which are going now back to the additional symmetries that I mentioned. Thick boundaries, again, these are symmetries. Alternating repetition, these are translational symmetries. Positive space, so there is a convexity in the spaces. Good shape, local symmetries, multiple symmetries. Multiple symmetries, I mean like not one overall symmetry for architects. One overall symmetry is mostly insignificant. I mean like 1,000 smaller and smaller and smaller symmetries all nested within each other. This is the concept of fractals, but with symmetries, symmetries within symmetries. So here are some sketches of Alexander's elements, the properties. Strong centers, you can see this is very strong, and it pulls the region to the center. Thick boundaries, this is very important. Think of the windows and the doors that you love most of all. They all have thick boundaries. The ones that have a pencil line boundary, I'm sure you don't like. Alternating repetition, which is opposed to monotonous repetition. In fact, an article we're writing with Anne Sussman shows that monotonous repetition gives headaches to people, but alternating repetition sort of has a wave structure and is much more congenial to the brain. Positive space, no re-entry roofs that feel like they're going to fall down on you. Good shape, nothing weird, broken, dismembered. That gives alarm to the human brain. Local symmetry, so here, something fanciful that combines bilateral symmetries with rotational symmetries. And so it's fun, but the buildings of the past that somehow draw us have thousands of these symmetries on very different scales, and again, an overall bilateral symmetry is not so important because that's one out of 1,000. So how about contemporary ornament? Architects are able to adapt tried and tested ornamental techniques. We know we have documented design tools, 3,000 years of ornamentation. They can create wonderful ornament today, and the creative architect can use techniques for today that save an enormous amount of time. So, whereas you would require 6 months to do some ornaments using chipping stone by hand, you can manufacture it today in 1 week or in 1 day. Unfortunately, none of this is taught in our schools, but maybe that will change in the future. For those who are beginning, and you say, well, all of that knowledge has been lost creating ornament. Oh, here are 15 properties of Alexander, plus everything else, all the writings that we have put together. You create visual patterns that trigger attractive neural responses. And you use the fractal mode of cognition of the brain. Remember, the perceptual fluency depends upon layers and layers and layers of getting smaller and smaller and smaller objects to contribute. And so you can make the built environment as a source for bodily and mental healing. And then you can run it through VAS scan to see if you have done a good job, and the VAS scan will show you, that you actually are looking at it. And you have separate checks like computer Biophilic Healing Index. If that's high, great. If it's low, then add something from there. Architects for the past 100 years have criticized ornament, but that criticism is both misleading and correct. Pasting ornament on a form is silly because it doesn't lead to anything. It doesn't lead to a fractal. But that's not the way to ornament things. Okay, that's not the creation of ornament. You only get superficial decoration. So even I see all the time on Arch Daily, somebody gets a fractal and makes fractal panels and sticks them onto something. It's stupid. It doesn't work because the whole point of our talk and Richard's talk is that the fractal has to have all these levels of scale to connect together. You just can't stick a piece there. So that doesn't work, okay? You just stick something on and it's going to work only by chance. You're doing hit and miss. It's an ignorance of nature because nature is unified with fractal scaling and with the multiple symmetries. So I want to propose a revolutionary approach to design, which is really going back and remembering what used to be known. You anchor the design process on ornament. sort of have a vague idea of what you're designing and zero in on the ornament, on what's going to connect you. So you, the architect, or you use a Christopher Alexander's a group decision process. You get 5 people together and you ask them, what ornament will really connect to this? And you build that ornament. You start with the ornament and then you fill in the rest. Fill in the rest, that's it's secondary. You use all the design tools that we know throughout all of history and now that are verified by neuroscience to focus human attention onto the structure. And so here, you do the ornament first, and then you stick in some plain things just to hold the form together. And you have your structure. So to conclude, ornament is not simply something to be added. It's a misunderstanding, and it has led to polemics, but all that is just a confusion. Start architectural design from the organic ornament and then fill in the rest of the form. And then hopefully you will get something that is coherent. You create the large fractal where the smaller scales are the ornament. And then the warning I gave earlier, which is still valid more than ever. Ornament is necessary to wire the intelligence in the developing child's brain. So if we continue the way we are doing harm to our children. So that's the conclusion of my talk. I just want to mention 2 series of lectures of mine that are free online. One is Algorithmic Sustainable Design. Those are free online, and the new course, Unified Architectural Theory, and those lectures are free online. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much. And I am finished.
Thank you both, Richard and Nikos. I think our heads are all collectively probably spinning from the amount of information that we've all learned and absorbed today. This is really wonderful.
Really fantastic.
As a reminder, if you have questions, and I'm sure you do, please put them in the chat, and we will call on you to unmute and ask your question. But we have a few ourselves to get started.
Yeah, so while people gather their thoughts, I thought I'd start with a question. So as a young artist, one of the first things that my high school art teacher taught me were the 7 principles of art and design, which are balance, rhythm, pattern, emphasis, contrast, unity, and movement. Then the elements of art, which are line, rhythm, pattern, emphasis, line, shape, space, value, color, and texture. So in using these, you create a whole composition. So it was fascinating to me to encounter these in Christopher Alexander's work, as well as Nikos' writing, and how scientific research like Richard's is helping to prove why these age-old principles still hold so true. So my question is actually about the relationship between visual coherence and complexity. Nikos, in your book, I think it's called 12 Lectures on Architecture, you make a point about the importance of balancing ornament with plane regions. And I would agree with that statement based on intuition. So this is kind of a question for both of you. Can you talk about how our brains read a surface that has pockets of ornamented detail and then areas of plain space, and how that works together? And I think there's something in there maybe about the difference between how we read perforated versus accretive fractals. And this kind of seems to get at the heart of the distinction between stochastic natural fractals as opposed to intentional design.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to go first, Nikos?
No, you go first.
Okay. So I see everything that you've talked about is sort of like, aesthetics is a sort of visual game that we are all engaged in, and, we want to get it right. So in terms of looking at something, I think, Nikos showed great eye tracking, and I showed a little bit as well. And when you're looking out at nature, what you are doing with your eye scan is basically confirming that what you've got, all that you've got is a fractal pattern. Because what you don't, if there's a tiger, you know, hiding into the forest, then you want to see that pretty quickly. And so all of that eye tracking, that's what it's doing. But it's not a hard task that our visual systems are designed to do it, and they actually enjoy doing it. And so all of our experiments are showing that when your eye is going around and searching and gradually confirming, parts of the brain that are getting activated are things like the default mode network, which is a network that gets activated during mind wandering and things like that. So it's important to realize that this sort of visual game of aesthetics, even though some people call it survival aesthetics, in a way we've got so good at it that we want to play that game. And if instead you give somebody something that's very plain, that doesn't have all of these things on different size scales, doesn't have the complexity, then you're not allowing our system to play the game that through evolution it's meant to be playing. And so that's what we've got to capture, is things that align with our basic needs.
Okay, so I guess I'll go. The way I interpret Cassandra's question is that why do we sometimes need plainness in addition to complexity? Well, plainness is sometimes, not always, a piece of plainness is sometimes useful in order to emphasize a highly complex structure. For example, if you have a courtyard that is surrounded by magnificent 16th century buildings, all ornamented, you don't want to have too much ornament inside the courtyard and the pavement itself. So that's one architectural example. So, but if everything is plain, then there's nothing there. It's dull, and you feel anxiety. So plainness has its use as a balancing mechanism, but it has been abused for decades, and that's the bad part of it. The abuse of plainness.
You definitely need that sweet spot of mid-complexity, you know. So I think, you know, thinking about your question, if you surround yourself with way too much complexity, then you've again moved away from that special condition that, you know, all of our processing systems, mechanisms are built to actually process.
Mm-hmm.
But it is an individual thing. And I think that this is what's so inspiring, that, you know, that there are, like I mentioned, Jackson Pollock, that for whatever reason decided to gravitate towards slightly higher complexity than the population. And so that really emphasizes the need for human-centered design. We need to take into account the occupant of the building.
Yeah, probably.
Let me throw in one more architectural example. In Europe, you have some wonderful Romanesque churches that you go in and everything is absolutely perfect. Okay, and then you see that there is a balance of some plain pieces and highly ornamented pieces. Now, maybe in the same city, somebody went in and ruined those churches by putting Baroque decoration all over. Well, it became too much. Okay, so you say, well, it's sort of indigestible. It was much nicer before, because whoever did the Baroque renovation had no idea of this very careful balance that the original architects had.
That's a great example. I tend to think about overly Baroque as the antithesis of having too much ornament.
So we have a question that came up here that author Colin wanted us to read out loud. And I think it actually dovetails nicely off of Richard's last statement, which I think to me implied, you know, there is kind of neurodiversity, right? And so some people, especially maybe artists, might be attracted to fractal dimensions that the average population isn't. And of course, that's important to recognize. There probably isn't any singular. There's an average, but probably each person is unique on that spectrum. But I am very curious that both of you had mentioned that in sort of, I don't know if the right word is indigenous or sort of cultures where modernism hasn't taught this creed of abolishing ornament. Ornament is kind of a natural outgrowth of human construction. People put it on objects, they put it on buildings, and it's kind of, it's not necessarily something that's even thought about or analyzed. So Colin's question was, are there observable trends in how biophilic architecture has been as societies become more urbanized and sort of go through that transition? And tacking onto that, sort of from my own curiosity, I'm wondering if there's been any sort of examination of maybe the fractal dimension of sort of, Richard, you had that slide of mandalas and ornament cultures from around the world, but have you looked at sort of how the fractal dimension might have changed throughout time, anything like that?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, one of our latest results are showing that 2-year-old kids are already showing effects similar to the adults. So it's an interesting question of the nature versus nurture, about how much is acquired truly through evolution, which is a very long time scale, versus how much has happened over the last couple of 100 years versus how much is happening within our lifetimes. And we don't really truly have a great feeling for, we know that by 2, people have already acquired this sort of appreciation, even though they've not spent much time looking at architecture. Then presumably there's further adaptation, so you mentioned Jackson Pollock. One possibility there is that he spent so much time looking at a particular level of complexity that he actually kind of adapted to it, got used to it, and needed to push further. And so kept on pushing further and further and further. And so I think that that's obviously a big question. And I think that's going to be a major practical issue, that do we, have to keep on adapting fractals as people spend a long time in a room, for example. And we don't really know all the answers to these questions. What we do know, though, is that there is a sort of, the mechanisms are universal, but there are individual variations. So we know that within the population, most people prefer mid-D, mid-complexity, but there are a smaller group of people that we refer to the Sharpies, who have very high complexity. There are a group called the Smoothies that have low complexity. And we don't know yet what the connection is. But you mentioned one, that it could be that people who are particularly skilled at visual things, such as architects and artists, might actually have a higher level of tolerance for higher complexity and might prefer slightly higher D values than the majority of people.
Yeah, Kyle has a question, and Kyle, I'm wondering, would you like to unmute and ask it yourself, or do you want us to read it?
Could you read it, please?
Absolutely.
Can't unmute it.
Kyle Dugdale wonders if Dr. Salingaros could be persuaded by the suggestion that in a world increasingly filled with moving images of extraordinary complexity, architectural minimalism is ceding to complexity in other areas, and so that minimalism is therefore more necessary today than it was 50 years ago.
No, I cannot be convinced by that argument. That's an argument for continuing minimalism, which has done tremendous damage to human civilization and the human race.
Yeah. And yeah, I can add in there that all of our studies are starting to show that dynamic fractals are even more preferred than static fractals. So we want even more complexity, that motion is good. And again, it comes back to what we need visually. Think about flickering flames in a fire, or trees moving in the breeze, or the light dancing off the water. If you took a static image of that, removed the complexity due to motion, the aesthetics falls off.
I may add one thing. In the minimalist world, it forces people to find refuge on the screen. It detaches people from the real world. We're seeing that. We're pushing people to detach because the real world is so boring and sometimes dead and oppressive. So, I mean, this is a gold mine for those who control the information content and the media. I don't like this development at all. Frightening.
And I think it is an important question, though, to what extent, Richard had mentioned that, perhaps our experiences in life sort of change our response to fractals, and that we might get conditioned or have a new baseline. And it is, interesting, the amount of images we are exposed to every day virtually is vast indeed, compared to any humans in any previous time. But whether those images, it makes me wonder if you could design a phone or computer interface to have some of those fractal properties as well, you could have a huge impact on that too. It makes me think of, I've had conversations with people who believe the future of ornament and architecture might actually be in virtual reality, where everybody inhabits boring boxes and then you wear glasses that add the ornament that you wish to each box. So you could walk around and computer algorithms would generate a Gothic arch on every, on every square window. And that world also to me is unappealing, because I just find that there's more even than just the visual projection to ornament. So to that end, I'm actually curious. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, Anne Sussman just made a comment about how minimalism actually leads to dissociation, and that's exactly the problem. You're kind of adding more of the problem to the problem, because when we're looking at our phones or computers, we are completely dissociated. We're not thinking about anything around us, and minimalist design doesn't really help with that. In fact, it just emphasizes. So.
If I could just say one quick thing.
Yes,
of course.
please.
I'm in the dark here, but you're exactly right. So what happens is subliminally, we're taking in all these things when we're in nature, when we're in the streets in Siena. We're taking in so many things and we're connecting to space and other people. And the problem is we're dissociating when we're in a car. We're completely in an envelope. A neuroscientist explained to me, cars are envelopes. They dissociate you completely. And then also, if we're completely virtual, my son's in grad school, and he said to me, Mom, I actually, after COVID, went to one class. Now I see what I've been missing. Classes only virtual on Zoom, this is fantastic, are not the same, because people subliminally take in sounds, smells, expressions that are a little bit off kilter in Zoom. So we're getting more and more dissociated. So the idea that we'll be wearing all, oh my God, we'll all be 3D virtual reality is terrifying. I'm sorry, Lisa, I'm too much of a baby boomer to be able to accept that.
I don't accept it either. I think we're on your side here. Though, it's better than nothing, maybe, but it's a slippery slope. But Richard, I was going to ask you and also just mention this, and this is kind of where I was leading. I've read a lot of research lately on simulating natural environments in architecture, and one of the breakthroughs has been realizing people prefer air streams to be fractal as well. So rather than having a fan blow air at you at a constant volume, you actually feel more comfortable if the air is kind of stochastic and simulates natural wind patterns. So I'm wondering, are there other senses that also are fractal? That we can...
Anne just mentioned it, and we're coming up with these sort of buzzwords, and we refer to them as atmospheric fractals, where instead of we just concentrate on visual, we bombard every sense. So there's, there's sonic fractals. You just mentioned, variations in breezes. You can have variations in heat patterns. You can have variations. Some people are starting to sort of explore fractal textures on surfaces. And many people, have this condition of synesthesia where they transfer across the senses. And the hope is that we will get an emergence happening, that all of these you know, immerse somebody in this atmosphere of fractals, you know, where they walk into this room and they see and feel and listen to these fractals. And this natural emergence happens in the way that when we walk through a forest, it happens, right? Because bird song is fractal and the sound of running water is fractal. And again, it all emphasizes getting this level of complexity right. That if you increase the complexity of the sonic fractal, maybe you need to reduce the visual fractal a little bit, because we don't want to get, you know, right on that scale of super high complexity, because that takes us out of our processing zone. But yeah, so this is the world we're in now, and I completely agree with it. The last thing we want to do is dissociate. The last thing we want also is, you know, that one of the most appealing things that I find about this is it's a great art-science collaboration. If we go back to the 1980s and look at some of the horrendous posters of fractals that were produced, it's because they were essentially produced by scientists with no artistic input whatsoever. Mm-hmm. And that's what I love about everything that we've been talking about today. Within that complexity, there's enormous amount of flexibility for artistic creation.
So Kelly has a question. Kelly, would you like to unmute and ask Nikos and Richard if you're there?
Hello, I'm here. Yeah, I just was wondering if, like, you know, how you kind of feel about like jelly screen specifically in terms of symmetry and visual complexity and how the brain might process that, because like often it's an entire wall that just like has a lot of perforations that are decorative in order to encourage ventilation. So I was wondering, like, kind of if you kind of studied maybe how the brain processes that visually.
I'm sorry, I didn't understand. You mentioned some sort of screen.
Here, I'll like type it into the chat. Like this.
Oh, jelly screen. Yeah, they're very beautiful. They're an example. Yeah, example from Islamic Hindu architecture where it's sort of perforated, very, very beautiful. And it has fractal scaling and tremendous amount of symmetries. They really create a wonderful environment. Mm-hmm. So,
and I think this really emphasizes something, you know, because when I got into this field, people were saying, well, do you really have to collaborate with a mathematician or a scientist to get your designs right? And what you've got to remember is that you have all got this magnificent fractal detector for free that has taken millions and millions of years with. And often if you go with your intuition, you will get it right. And so my latest collaboration I mentioned on the carpets, where I'm, you know, collaborating with two designers, 13 and 9 design in Austria. They would create designs based on their intuition. And then my role was almost like the fractal police to come along and check that they hadn't violated and, or, you know, and created the criminal act. And they never had. Their intuition as designers usually was spot on. And so this is a lot more easy than you think it can be. And the fact that this has been going on for centuries until recently just shows how natural a process it is. You really don't need somebody like me to come along and do a fractal analysis. You can rely on this natural, great fractal detector that you've got for free.
It's a nice statement.
oh.
Nice.
Well said, Richard. Here, 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 here.
All right. So we have a question from Andre. Would you like to unmute yourself?
You hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, my question is totally unrelated to architecture in this case, and even art, as you might expect. But my question was about reading. Is reading the book, reading the line in the book, reading the text, reading the letters, some kind of fractal process too? And how does it depend on language and the speed of reading the line? How much it is important for designing the book? Because old books were all kind of clearly designed by the artists and writers. Like you read Joyce, it's very clearly seen design, like every letter is kind of clear and you remember it. It's not like casual. So I wonder how it's important at this point, how it's compared to like reading from computer and in terms of reading overall.
Mm-hmm. I can say two things about reading text. And one of the early theories was attention restoration theory. where the psychologist called Kaplan declared that looking at nature is a very different way of looking than doing other tasks. And they called it soft fascination. And that when you look out on that complexity, it actually restores your capabilities compared to hard fascination, where you do something like reading a book. And that level of concentration of going line by line and line and line and line, that's what wears you out and builds up your stress level. The fractal trajectories, that's what produces the soft fascination. And so, you know, so that's definitely in there, you know, like, I'm not saying about reading a book. So for example, designing, say the consoles in an aircraft cockpit, some research have started to propose that maybe you shouldn't row up those dials in rows because that's not what we're meant to do. You should think about doing some sort of fractal design to encourage the, you know, the effortless looking that we've all acquired through looking at nature. Now, I do know, getting a kind of not related, but similar thing, people have looked at occurrences of words in different books and found that there is actually fractal content there buried in from a creative aspect. But the actual mechanistic raster scanning of the book is actually hard fascination and very different from the soft fascination of looking out of a window onto nature.
Makes me wonder if there's some way we can print books such that we read in a more fractal form. It kind of reminded me of Apollinaire's calligrams, where you read poetry kind of like in different shapes, but that might still qualify as hard fascination. I know.
Medieval Bibles and Book of Kells.
Yeah. So I'll move on to a question from Sabina. She asks, this is about symmetry and asymmetry. I think it's a direct reaction to what Nikos was talking about. But can't some asymmetry make buildings more visible? We should slow down to process that, right?
Asymmetry, if it's not balanced, leads to anxiety. I don't think it's good to inject anxiety in the built environment. Asymmetry, when it is balanced, it means that you have an arch or you have a perfect balance. So you can incorporate asymmetry within symmetry, that's okay. But I think what is referred to here is straight asymmetry. No, that leads to increasing all the alarm signals in the body that leads to stress. I do not buy that. I do not like the way architecture has been going in the last 20 years. Well, let me conclude that statement. It's not because of my personal liking or disliking. We're talking about human health here. We're talking about the health of the users that is shown over years, that stress from the built environment creates increasing infections, increasing autoimmune diseases. It is really very bad for people. So I don't like these games that architects play with asymmetry. And I read very much the artistic justifications given for asymmetry. Innovation, freedom of design. Well, if it harms people, those should not be commissioned. Okay, I'm not talking about an architectural police. I'm talking about people who commission these things. You know, you want to commission something that creates harm to the users, that's not a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, stress is so toxic, it can lead to deep depression, to schizophrenia. And yet all we have to do is look to nature to find the answer and then adapt it. And we've got our answer.
Yeah, well, you know, it is interesting in a lot of those examples of natural fractals that you showed, Richard. You know, of course, there isn't symmetry in the human organized, you know, simple bilateral way. You get, yeah, you get a statistical sort of appearance of symmetry, and it's you know, it's interesting to think about how architects can learn from that.
Yeah.
You know, you obviously don't get stressed looking at a deformed tree that isn't at all, you know, symmetrical. but perhaps a leaning crazy cube. Again, I think it depends so much on context. But
yeah. But if you remember that image I showed of morphing from an exact fractal to a statistical one, and I think that that's very symbolic, because what we have started off with the basic symmetry and then thrown in a little bit of randomization. But we've not thrown in a huge amount of randomization that caused everything to be on one side. And if you think about a Jackson Pollock painting, and his style was referred to as the all-over style because of that, because it kind of had this sort of dancing motion, captured the natural rhythms, and had some degree of randomness in it, but not to the extreme. And I think it's when we go to the extremes that we run into the problems.
And kind of jumping off of that, we have a question from Paul here about the carpet examples that Richard was showing at the end of his talk. And he was saying how he noticed they didn't seem to follow Alexander's principles, the 7 principles that Nikos had cited. And I'm very curious about that as well, because one of the lingering questions in my mind has been, how do we reconcile, I think we've phrased this in different ways already, but sort of the stochastic random fractals that we see in nature that seem to have informed those carpets with more traditionally what human ornament has produced.
And I think we're in this grand game. So, they're just being installed in big buildings, like universities and banks and things like that. And they really do, context is everything, right? So if we walked into a room and we had fractal carpet, fractal wallpaper, fractal ceilings, fractals on the windows, it's probably going to be all too much. And so, we're going to be going into these sites and doing, studies of occupants and finding out what levels can we get away with or not. And I think what you're asking, though, and I think it's the big question that I'm not quite sure of, and I think maybe Nikos and I might differ a little bit, is to what extent do you really need the exact fractal versus the statistical fractal? And if you think that we've been trained on the statistical fractal, but walking into a building is different from walking into a forest. And we've got to respect that. And that's what biophilia really does respect. It's not just saying, hey, we want to walk out into a forest. It's saying, hey, we need to learn from it and put it into this artificial environment. And that's where all the fun and game comes. We're going to learn from nature, but we've got to adapt it. And does that mean that we go all the way and create exact fractals? I don't know. But a little plug, although, this Mohawk are putting them in buildings and they're great carpets and they cost a lot of money. Because of the stress related to the pandemic, I've convinced Mohawk to release the patents for free as stress reducing screensavers. And that's going to happen next week.
I would like to try my hand in answering this question. Richard presented a talk on fractals. I presented a talk that added 2 different things altogether. One is biophilia. So biophilia say we have a certain number of properties, one of which is fractals. There are other properties, okay? So Richard's carpets do not satisfy some of the other properties, but they do satisfy the fractal, okay? So if you want all the properties, then, you complain to Richard. Also in my talk, I talked about something else entirely, Alexander's properties, okay? One of the properties is fractals, but there are other properties, okay? So if Richard's carpets don't satisfy some of the other properties of Alexander, you complain to Richard.
Or you find them elsewhere in the room.
Exactly.
Yeah. But, when you walk into that room, you're not going to get everything from the carpet. And so we've got to treat it as a holistic environment. And like we're saying, not just visually, but sonically, thermally, breeze, texturally. There's lots of great ways and we've got to deliver the right balance.
And if I may add something, why is Jackson Pollock a successful painter? Because his paintings are fractal, but then he has color. Okay, the nicest paintings have wonderful color and detail. It has nothing to do with fractals, but that adds to the appeal. So these are additional properties that I mentioned in my list of properties. So look, we're exposing these groups of properties that attract human beings, and we're focusing today on the fractals. Compare this with 20 years ago when people say, everything has to be, blank or just white. This is a huge step forward.
Oh, we have one last comment in here from Randall, just about another artist, James Turrell. And he says, James Turrell has done such wonderful works, but I now realize after listening to this talk that his Ganzfeld pieces are striking, but also completely disorienting because there's absolutely no ornamentation or anything to focus on, which is a totally alien experience. When museums mount Turrell's work, people have been known to faint and collapse. So, yeah, powerful.
I pass on this because I don't know this artist, so since I don't know something, I cannot comment on it. However, I will comment upon that certain prize-winning art museums that have slanted walls, people have been known to enter and get nausea and collapse. And the architect is wealthy enough to cover up this thing that happens repeatedly. I'll end there.
So we do have some more questions coming in, looks like, but I'm cognizant of the fact that it's 8 p.m. Well, let's see. In Texas, it's 7 p.m. and in Oregon, it's 5.
Yeah.
So if you guys have further commitments, don't feel obligated to stay. But if you want to keep engaging some questions, I think you can stay as long as people have some.
Sure.
Okay, great. And everybody who's joined us and who needs to go, thank you so much for coming. Please do join us again for the last installment of this spring series, which will be on
April 26th.
Yeah, Monday, April 26th. And that one's going to be about actually making ornament. And we're really excited to have Gary, who graduated from, he was a PhD from Yale last year, studying ornament, as well as Matt McNicholas, who designs a lot of ornament through his architecture practice.
Mm-hmm.
So please do join us for that, and go to yaleornament.wordpress.com for the link. So now back to Greg's question. You want to read it?
Sure. Unless Greg wants to read it.
Yeah, Greg, do you want to unmute?
Sure. So I thought, when Richard Taylor talks about fractals, very often it feels like, because he said something about the fractals in the 80s did not look very good, and I completely, when Gleick's book came out, Chaos, and had all these really badly generated things, and Autodesk, you remember, produced a program back in the 80s as well that also looked very unnatural, and so those kinds of fractals don't actually sort of encompass a lot of the other sort of, they're not judged by the criteria that Nikos has raised. And Nikos and I teach at the same institution, Building Beauty, and we often talk about judging the life in things. And so when Professor Taylor said, we have this sort of natural fractal meter, I was wondering, for us, there's a larger meter. It's a kind of a meter of a geography, a sort of a geometry of living things that we are able to detect. It's this kind of, we can see that a thing has been a living thing at one point, that is certainly fractals are part of that. One of the factors of those things. But are you interested in characterizing either mathematically, but also looking for reactions and test and cases to fMRI studies and things like that? Some of these larger geometric properties that Nikos has mentioned, coming from Chris Alexander's work.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge is, I feel that we are just on the verge of, so many great things, and how do you go about it? And there are so many questions that I feel so excited that I don't even know where to begin. And I think that, you know, that's the problem. But the hard thing is just narrowing your scope to address some very detailed little things. And it's almost like every answer delivers a new question, which is a very exciting era to be in, because I really do feel that we, like Nikos mentioned, that we've got technology on our side now compared to, you know, when we construct the great Gothic cathedrals, and the technology that they had and the technology that we've got. I just feel that the time is right now to show the correct respect for nature again, and to go with it in whatever way we can. And you know, it's not going to be perfect. So, you know, we install these carpets. Hopefully 2 years' time, after all of the experiments, we'll learn a little bit more. But certainly we know that whenever we are going to put something into a room, that visual experience that you have is not all going to be related to that one stimulus, that it's going to be a very holistic thing, incorporating many things.
Excellent.
I wonder if Anne Sussman is still around. Anne Sussman has really clarified what's going on. The medical profession has done phenomenal things in the last 5 years only, undreamed of results. They're not learning from us. They're going and seeking knowledge. They're doing fMRI studies. They're publishing. You know, we don't even need to get huge grants into experiments. The medical profession is pursuing this wonderfully. And then what is half driving all of this is the commercial industry, the car manufacturers, the advertising people. So Anne Sussman has identified this. This is where the action is. Tens or hundreds of millions of dollars are spent there in order to find out how the human body reacts to visual stimuli and our environment.
Yeah,
this is happening outside. Yeah, so Anne, here you are.
Oh, Nikos, you're too fun. And it was wonderful listening to you talk, Richard. I'm so excited you're in the second edition of my new book coming out, Cognitive Architecture. Everybody needs to know what you've said about fractals. And you're in the book too, Nikos. The thing that's so important is what's scary to me is how much the car companies and the tech companies and the companies like Apple really understand how the human brain and body works. There are companies like iMotions.com, which are used by all retailers, by Honda, BMW, GM, to really deconstruct the human experience so they can completely manipulate what we do and to make us buy more stuff. And the problem is nobody's using this science really to build better crosswalks, better schools, to make it safer to walk into town. That's what's a little bit discouraging, but the fact is the science is all there. The science is all there. And because the car companies, you know, and the tech companies, they take science very seriously. In Apple, they hire PhD neuroscientists to drive their design. And they understand, as Nigel Nicholson says, a UK psychologist, you can take the person out of the Stone Age. You can't take the Stone Age out of the person. He wrote that for a Harvard Business Review article. Harvard Business Review is the magazine of Harvard Business School. He wrote that in 1998. So they've been talking about, you know, how hardwired the human experience is at business schools for at least 20 years. And so this gap between, there is this gap, but I think architecture is changing. I am hopeful, Nikos and Richard, I am hopeful that architecture will change and become more adaptive to how humans actually are. But I also think we have to be compassionate for how modernism happened. As you know, if you read my books and my work, modernism is direct expression of the PTSD of World War I. We now know Walter Gropius was mentally ill. He had PTSD, and I showed some of my work to a Harvard medical school professor, and I made him go through Gropius's house with me. And he said to me, every single move this man made in the house is representative of PTSD. It's defensive design. It's the way PTSD works. And the fact is, though, the medical profession really didn't understand PTSD until quite recently. It didn't go into the medical books until 1980 in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and it didn't, be able to do MRI really didn't happen until like 1990s. And then when you do an MRI, you can actually see that someone's been through a war, it's changed their brain. So they're going to process stimuli differently. I don't want to
And
take off. What?
I was just going to say, I do wonder, and we had talked a little while ago. Richard had mentioned shifting baselines and how the brain becomes more tolerant of or accustomed to things. And I think PTSD is an interesting example where it would be fascinating for me to understand ways in which people affected by PTSD might perceive or react to fractals differently, or if in fact fractals might be 60% reduction in stress that Richard mentioned is incredible. To think that a design intervention could be capable of that, could that actually, it's interesting that the designers suffering from PTSD would have had an aversion to fractals, whereas perhaps fractals are actually, precisely what might be a helpful cure.
More questions from the attendees?
Let's see. Simon had asked about zooming out in one of Richard's photos. Simon, do you want to unmute and speak?
Please read it, my question. Read.
Okay. I think Simon is suggesting that when we zoom out of the picture drawn by Richard, we get
one of the carpets.
Yeah, one of the carpets, right? Is that what you're referring to? The carpets that Richard showed, we might be able to get the 15 properties as we keep zooming out. Is that right, Simon? Right.
Yes.
As you know, I mean, it's been a really interesting experience. So, we carefully designed a fractal pattern that we thought that was going to work. The designers and the what we call the design police and the fractal police, and we got everything perfect. And then Mohawk said, well, we're going to have to cut them up into tiles, and we can't give any instructions about how they're going to be laid down. So then suddenly, within having spent months designing a pattern, we had to, within a week, quickly check whether if you cut it up and randomly rearrange it, what is the effect on it? And I think that this is one of the really interesting things is the design constraints, that it's not just the equivalent of an artist coming up to a canvas, that you've got to figure out things about the room and what's going to happen, like what's going to happen when you put a table or a chair on top of the fractal and disrupt, its visual. And so this is why I find we're at this really now fascinating era where we can ask some really fundamental neuroscience questions, but some really basic questions related to, design architecture. And this is the era that we're heading into, that it's going to be a whole set of different, earlier I used the word police. There's going to be a whole set of police coming in and checking everything's okay. But if we get it right, then it's going to be a major improvement.
Thank you.
May I interject? I'm sorry, I cannot answer your question because Richard designed the carpets looking at the fractals, not using the 15 properties. So if you find the 15 properties, then it is accidental. And I think it's very nice, but not designed that way. But I want to rephrase something that Richard said. I would not use the word police because that is a very bad association.
Yeah.
What I would say, however, is that now for the first time, we have a quantitative method. We can make these estimates, okay? We can quantitatively estimate, is this structure fractal or not? Then, looking at what I presented, which is more general than fractals, can we quantify biophilia? Yes, we can give an estimate for biophilia. Can we quantify Alexander's 15 properties? Well, yeah, we can add them. How many of the properties are present here? These are quantifiable estimates. Nothing like this has been known in the aesthetics of architecture before. And we finally have these, and they're crude at the moment, but they will help because it's no longer a matter of opinion. You can actually give numbers to these.
Thank you.
Anne, you want to take over again? Anne wants to take over again. Okay, other questions? Misha?
that's the end of our chat here, but I know we still have 41 people hanging out with us. And I know for me, those talks generate a lot of questions. So Nikos and Richard are willing, if anybody has any questions at all,
if you'd like to unmute yourself,
send them out. Yeah, if you want to unmute yourself at this point, feel free. Well, maybe I'll ask a question sort of on behalf of anybody in the audience here who's a student or a lifelong learner. If someone's a designer and looking to enhance their fractal fluency, understand the basic vocabulary, where should they start? What should they start reading and looking at?
I think that, there's lots of great books out there, but, using the buzzwords and whatever. But I think, even Mandelbrot emphasized that the beauty of fractals wasn't in the equations, it was in the geometry they produced. And a great analogy for me is in the Jackson Pollock world that I became an art authenticator. And the preeminent scholar there was a guy called Francis O'Connor. He was trained in art theory, so he had no science background. And he would get all of these imitation Pollocks and have to make a decision on them. And he would send them to me and I would pass them through the computer analysis. So he was using his, what I call the natural fractal detector in his eye. I was using the computer. And there was a complete agreement through the years in terms of his opinion going on his natural intuition of fractals, and the computer with its rigorous mathematical equations. And so that's the thing that I would emphasize is how did Francis O'Connor do that? He did that by staring and staring and staring at Jackson Pollock fractal paintings. So I think it's great to read lots of books on fractals, but I think the really important thing is to look at lots of images of the fractals so that you trust your intuition about when you're staring at them, that you do recognize them.
I would like to make a suggestion. Don't read the books on fractals. Look at pictures of fractals, but don't read the books on fractals. Find online the free articles by Richard Taylor, okay, who is not only, in addition to be a great guy and a good scientist, is a wonderful writer, and many of those are non-technical. So you go through 2 or 3 of Richard's articles, and you're going to learn about fractals in a very nice way. So I think that's the easiest and best way.
You can see why Nikos and I are friends. We say really nice things about each other.
It is fascinating. The way you're describing is almost kind of like teaching a kind of black box machine learning algorithm. You feed it a ton of data, and then you teach it to recognize and then produce what it's seeing.
Mm-hmm.
And to that end, I think there's, in addition to contemporary technology allowing us to analyze fractals, I'm curious if Richard, you see any prospects for, maybe there's nothing new under the sun, but are there potentials with contemporary machine learning and sort of generative design to produce fractals and really implement them in the physical world in ways that we hadn't been able to previously?
Mm-hmm. We are using machine learning now on Pollock paintings. That's partly because that there's a lot of legal issues to do with assessment of paintings. So if you can rely on a machine to do it that's well trained, then it kind of helps a lot. But there are definitely 2 types of fractals, and this has kind of come up in a lot of answers today, that are the ones that are generated by a computer, and then they're the ones that are generated by human beings. And you can sense that human touch. Mm-hmm. Even in Mondrian paintings with his horizontal and vertical lines, if you look closely, there are purposeful little variations in those lines that we do crave the human fingerprint that a computer-generated fractal doesn't have. And we use lots of computer-generated fractals in our psychology experiments just to, because we can easily control them. But we've compared human response to the mathematical fractals to ones in art, to ones in nature, and they all trigger the same response. So again, I'm a great fan of doing something more like Pollock did, where his fractals came from this balance issue, this dynamic balance issue. And I think those are the sorts of fractals that sort of people like, rather than the carefully calculated ones. There needs to be a sort of human expression in there somewhere.
It kind of reminds me a little bit of Arabic and Moorish ornament, where the idea is that it can't be perfect. You have to have one tiny imperfection that kind of lets you know that it is human-made. And it also reminds me too of, I think in The Nature of Order, Christopher Alexander's book, he talks about, I think it was diatoms, where they're made of so many different little facets, and they're all pretty much the same, except for one that's like unique. It kind of throws it off just enough that it makes it look really interesting, and all the other little shapes have to kind of like work together to make this whole diatom. And I think it's really fascinating, and just speaks to the importance of having just that one little like asymmetry, or just that one little imperfection that makes everything jive.
Yeah.
It's a question.
Hi, Misha and Cass. This is Matt McNicholas. Can I jump in here real quick?
Absolutely. Beautiful ornament behind you, by the way.
Sorry?
Beautiful ornament in your background, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, Louis Sullivan. So, the master. I do want to say, Professor Taylor, Dr. Taylor, I've been citing your work here now for about 6 or 7 years in my lectures. So thank you for all of that amazing work. And Nikos, of course, we've had some conversations, and agree with you wholly. So this has been absolutely fascinating. I just want to jump in real quick. I hope to speak to it on the 26th, but with regard to the question on how to start with design, we talk about fractals and looking at fractals and all that kind of stuff. I would encourage anyone who wants to start with designing ornament that does all of these things that we're talking about here. Just look at nature. Just go straight to nature. Go to the fountainhead. The source, study a plant from its root to its stem to its blossom, and just see how all the pieces come together. And then you can get some of what you're talking about, Cass, with that, small asymmetries, or those little like balanced symmetries, or all those pieces. But just really looking at nature herself and studying her is, I think, where everyone should start, and that's where all the masters started. Wright and Sullivan and the like. So, my 2 cents.
We're right back to Richard's first slide.
Yeah. Although, the beauty is I'm looking out of my window here at the University of Oregon. And of course, that's where Christopher Alexander did his Oregon experiment in 1975. And that's why a lot of professors stay when they come to Oregon, because we have a beautiful campus. And what is amazing is that hardly any of our faculty, if I wandered out there and said, do you know anything about this campus? Hardly any of them would know the word Alexander. Huh. But his legacy is there outside my window right now.
And it's a shame, because the Oregon Experiment's an amazingly short and beautiful little book.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah.
One of these days, post-COVID,
You've got to get this in. Sure. Okay. I love you.
Yeah, I think that it's so fascinating, Richard, what you're saying about.
Give me the olive, but put it in something else.
About the human-made ornament.
Look at the cat. Look at the cat. He's standing up.
Ornament. Sorry, I'm just gonna. Great. Human-made ornament. The computer ornament. I wonder. So, human-made ornament, like when someone draws something or makes it, you find has a similar property to like a tree that's been affected by certain forces and so is imperfect. And so can you classify ornament that someone has drawn or chiseled or designed together with nature's patterns, and then the computer generated patterns in another category? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, you know, and I often, you know, it's hard to find a word for it, but, you know, it's that sort of organic feeling, you know, that people crave. And the computer generated ones, you know, you can add randomness in, but it is by a strict random process. And, you know, pure randomness is very, very hard for a human being to pull off. You know, and the surrealists tried it and they got pretty close, but it's very hard. But it's in that human generated randomness compared to, you know, the computer generated randomness. That's where I think all of our deep needs lie. And, you know, so certainly when I retire, I want to go back to art again. I've spent all my career jumping between art and science. And when I get to 60, I'm just going to become an artist. And I want to generate artworks, which I did at art school when I went to art school in the 1990s, which are giant sort of machines that capture wind patterns and then transfer the wind patterns onto a canvas. And so you've kind of harnessed nature there to produce the thing, rather than just using a computer equation to get a computer to generate it. And that's what I've always liked, you know, when I came out with that term fractal expressionism. It's something deeper than what a computer can do. And it's always surprised me that when you say the word fractal, many people automatically jump to computers, when in fact, all of the great artists and architects through the centuries have been doing it way before we had computers.
Let me jump in. That's actually something that I've thought about a lot for a long time. And one of my conclusions, and I don't know if this is correct, tell me what you think. I think a lot of it has to do too with empathy. And you know, when you're looking at human-made art, you are able to kind of, even if you've never tried the process before, you can kind of see how the process, the procedure for how the art or the ornament was made. And maybe you can almost just imagine like the person carving the thing, or because there's definitely a fingerprint to it. And that's what's so special about human-made things, that you can't really ever replicate with computer-made things.
Yeah, I mean, it transfers all across everything, right? I mean, those of us who remember the 1980s when drum machines first came along, you know, and the synthesizer, and thought, okay, we're not going to have guitarists anymore. We're not going to have drummers anymore. But here we are. We need to see people playing drums, even if they can't quite nail it in the same way as the drum machine can. We don't want that. We want to see the human doing it.
Exactly.
Let me say something. I see the computer here not as a tool to design fractals, because the human mind is much better at designing fractals. However, I see the computer-driven manufacturing as the solution.
Yeah.
Because now you say, I want to build a building that looks as beautiful as Louis Sullivan. Well, people say, you know, it'll cost $50 million on top just for the ornamentation. No, it doesn't. We can computer generate the stuff. You know, somebody will draw it, and then you have the computer manufacturing. We have that capability. It's not being used. Hopefully, we'll see a fantastic revolution when you see that you can do it cheaply, and it's going to really tremendously increase the empathy that then the user will feel in the building. So the old, for a century, we've been saying we cannot put ornament because we cannot produce it economically. That's finished. We can produce the most wonderful ornament very economically today.
Yeah, and you know, you can even you know, design a pattern and then to channel Ruskin and his belief in the importance of imperfection. You can have a program that'll create imperfection and then 3D print it, you know, still without having to hire an artisan, but you're able to have, say, a repeating pattern that has a few kinks in it. So it has a bit of that roughness too, which I think.
Misha, I showed you in my slides, not repetition. Repetition is boring. Alternating repetition.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so you don't have to intentionally make it imperfect. Just make sure there's alternation.
Yeah, no, that was a great slide. Greg, did you want to unmute? You have another question here, I see.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is just, I'm just being practical here. You know, I'm interested in the computer, the issues of automation here, and there's an automatic evaluation of that Richard is doing on the partly for legal reasons, as he says, on the Pollock paintings. We're interested in seeing if we could do something like with no human intervention, something like an automated evaluation of the life in something that is maybe an image of the life in something, because the experience might be a little bit different, but let's just say from a point of view of an image. And this is something that, you know, is a very tough nut to crack, you know, and so it actually was one that interested Alexander his whole life, and Nikos helped him a great deal with that problem, I'm quite sure. I was just wondering if from Nikos, I was interested in whether or not you know, how he felt just sort of the mathematical evaluation of a scene's ability to have life in it, of an image's ability to have life in it, is something that he feels that any progress has been made on. And I don't mean the intervention of a person evaluating it. That the reality of the effect on people, I think, is the thing that Anne and Nikos have worked on, that I think is wonderful, and it's really a very important thing to give it that validity. But I'm interested also in whether or not we can create automated decision procedures for life. And that was the question for Nikos. The question for Richard, I'm sorry that I have two questions in the chat, it's my fault, but the question for Richard is the generative side of things. Since you are generating fractals on a professional basis, I have found very few fractals that have something like the complete sense of life in them that Alexander was talking about. And I mean, I actually have found one class of fractals that does have it, but most of them don't. And as you know, probably because of your comments about the 80s, that most of them don't have that natural quality to them, organic quality to them. And but so that was one question for Nikos, one question for Richard, and I'll leave it at that.
Well, I'll answer the question to me. The topic now, the whole discipline is in a state of fervent. We are creating things and deriving things. It is too early to automate it. You automate something after, you can do it by hand, and you do it for 10 years, 20 years, iron out everything and make it simple enough to automate it. We're not there yet. And I would be very, very cautious to automate something, because it can lock in something with flaws and you know, basic flaws in understanding. You don't want to do that.
Sure.
Or make it too facile and wind up being just as bad as what we're trying to improve, which is a sort of mechanistic view of humans as non-humans. You know, so I think it's premature to ask that. Okay, over to Richard.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've got to be fair to machine learning and computers. And, you know, we humans have been doing our games with fractals for far longer, you know, and, you know, but it's just fascinating how far we've come. You know, I first published my Jackson Pollock work in 1999. And it was controversial at that time because some people said, why on earth would you use a computer to assess something that is clearly designed to be looked at by a human being? And that was the big controversy. And there was also a little bit of controversy about where you can't quantify human expression and things like that. But it does emphasize that we've moved so far as a society where in 1999, it was shocking to some people to think that you could use a computer to look at artwork. But now we're into a society where we're happy to use computers to do virtually everything for us, particularly, you know, in terms of facial recognition and things like that. So even in my short period of my short career, we've seen enormous shifts, and it is coming. And, you know, the reason why it's kind of frightening to some of the art world, of course, if we go back to Jack, you know, I keep on thinking about Jackson Pollock, but it's absolutely terrifying to some people to think that a computer could actually generate something that is as like a Pollock as if Pollock had generated it. And I think it is coming down the line, but I think I agree that we're not there yet.
The question specifically, that was great, Richard. Thank you. But actually, the specific thing I was interested in, because we were talking about the evaluation that you had done, and Nikos saying it was too early and premature from the point of view of we're trying to get human values, actually sort of a natural values sort of recognized before we do any kind of automated, you know, lock in any automated decision-making procedure. But the generative side of it is quite interesting. That is, there are a few stages in the Mandelbrot set, for example, that look a little more natural than a lot of the other ones, right? So it's kind of, and there's one fractal that I think actually looks rather like a carpet, a good carpet made by a human being. This is the hopalong. I think you probably know it. I've been wondering if people have been playing with that and to see if, like, is it possible to make more organic looking things using something like hopalong, and who's been playing with those kinds of fractals along the lines of evaluating them for how much life they have in them. You know, so anyway, I'm just, if you know of something like that.
That's a great question. Like I say, I think we're right on this boundary now where we're going to see some, you know, massive improvements in the types of fractals that are going to be used. And like everything we've been kind of talking about tonight, the fractal element is just one element of a whole lot of things that have to pour in for the human being to really like it.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's beyond the automated system to do this.
Yeah, it just takes a lot of work to even get sort of move there a little.
And Misha, if you don't mind, I want to take over the seminar.
Okay.
I want to ask if there are any architecture students who have heard the talks. Please ask questions or speak up. Architecture students, if you think that Richard and I talked about something that's directly relevant to your education as an architecture student and how it compares to the rest of the courses that you're taking. So please, don't be shy, speak up.
I don't know if any students lasted with us through these 2 hours. I hope so.
They're too shy. That's a shame.
Richard, I am very fascinated though by your goals for art production, and I applaud some of those ideas you mentioned. Yeah. You know, it's a shame that you weren't at the our first lecture of the series. Of course, back then we didn't broadcast them, but Ornament and Ecology was a really interesting lecture because we talked about sort of the interface between natural phenomena and ornament. And Stacy Levy, who's one of the artists who spoke, well, she was the environmental artist who spoke. She's absolutely incredible. Doesn't think of her work through the lens of ornament per se, but her work since the 80s has been about translating nature's forces into visible, feelable, interactive pieces of art. And she had a piece actually where she basically registered this movement of wind, and it wasn't a canvas, it was actually like a dynamic piece of art where there are all these parts and pieces that moved and became a living sculpture based on the movement of wind. And of course, you know, we've had sculptures that do that for all sorts of forces, but it is fascinating, I think, thinking about, you know, again, talking about what are the future possibilities for generative fractals, you know, fractals that actually respond dynamically to ecological conditions, I find fascinating. There's an example in Milwaukee called River Pulse, where they've actually put these tubes or these sonotubes in the river. They actually measure the turbidity, the dissolved oxygen, the flow, the temperature, and then they use that to generate, actually I'm gonna pull it up because I can share my screen. But they use that basically to generate a pattern that they then project under a bridge in Milwaukee. So you can actually read sort of the, so there it is.
Yeah.
And the pattern basically changes based on all these conditions. So there's different ways in which dissolved oxygen or turbidity affects the pattern. And so as you start to learn what the pattern says, when you walk by the river under the bridge every day, you get a sense of the water quality. So I think it's an interesting example kind of in that vein.
Yeah, Misha, this is interesting from the artistic point of view. However, most of my friends are concerned about the everyday living environment. How do you make a house better using what we have discussed today? How do you make a bank building better? How do you make a restaurant better? How do you make a school better? There are many, many studies showing how detrimental school interiors are to students. They really decrease learning. Terrapin Bright Green did a study with just 1 or 2 biophilic factors, and there were like 20% improvement in the performance of the students. These are life and death questions for the everyday built environments. I think, well, my group of friends would like to concentrate there, apply this stuff, you know. So what you showed is beautiful and artistic, but I would like to concentrate on, you know, changing, say, 200,000 schools and make them better environments for students.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just suggesting that there are ways that as we do that, we can, you know, connect with nature using fractals in more profound ways. But I think those are all sort of tools in order to move us toward a healthier built environment, at least how I see it. We have a question from iPhone. Speaking of companies that, you know, Anne just told us about how evil Apple is, or not evil, but at least manipulative.
Just clever.
Clever. So anyway, iPhone asks, are the classical orders rich in A-list features? Maybe you guys could talk about the classical orders specifically as they relate to what we've been discussing.
Yeah, I can discuss that. Well, not the classical orders as they are taught, say, in Notre Dame University, but all of Greco-Roman classicism has fractal qualities, and they have been measured. Because if you just stop focusing on columns and pediments, you will see that the entire vocabulary of classicism and how it evolved and how it adapted is completely and totally fractal. So this fits within the fractal framework. And of course, to go beyond Richard, it's also highly symmetric, which is not part of fractal. So the additional symmetries, I think, make it more attractive. Now, where the fractal quality broke down of the classical architecture is when it was stretched. When it was stretched and purified in order to express power and oppression. You know where that happened? 1933, Italy, Germany. So falsely, in architecture books, you see it, you know, this is an evolution of classical architecture. No, it's not. It is a degradation of classical architecture stretched to make it unfractal, to make it frightening, which was the purpose, the psychological purpose. So yes, and whoever iPhone is, you know, if you contact me privately, I'll be happy to give you some references, you know, or other people who have done the fractal qualities of traditional classical design architecture.
Nikos, when you say that the sort of classical architecture has been measured, what specifically do you mean?
Oh, well, the world authority on that is Richard Taylor. You have computer programs that you put in a drawing, and then the program will measure going magnifying, continuously magnifying and seeing if there is structure there every time you magnify it. And then you do a box counting method and it computes even your fractal dimension. Okay, and the nicest classical architecture turns to be exactly what Richard predicts, you know, like a middle fractal, 1.4 dimension, 1.5 dimension. You know, people have done this. This is published.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder too whether you know, we can track the Apollonian Dionysian arc of art history throughout time by using fractal dimension. I don't know if that's something, you know, Baroque leading to, you know, neoclassical to Rococo, you know, back to rationalism, surreal, you know. Does that arc somehow have fractal qualities, Richard? Do you get a sense of that? No.
Yeah, no, I often feel like I'm some sort of fire preacher when I talk about fractals. You know, even I pause and wonder if this is some great conspiracy theory that everything is fractal, and it could well be.
I never know.
It's the matrix of fractals. That's
Yeah.
So Richard, how far away are we from an architecture student being able to design a facade and then put it through a program that will tell them the fractal dimension of the detailing they're putting on it?
Yeah, I mean, the programs are out there, and you know, like I think that this is one of these great, you know, problems of you know, art science divides, is that we've got science with all of these programs, you know, and okay, they're using it for chemistry or physics or, you know, biology, neuroscience, earth sciences, and then they're not well known across the gap, you know, where, you know, and it's not a you know, it's just an artificial gap. And I think that that's why I'm such a fan of the liberal arts education, is that there's these great tools in science that are open to architects to use. And so that they are there now. You know, it might.
Yeah, if I wanted to check my facade design, what would I do?
What are next steps?
Yeah.
I think, you know, the only problem is it is possible to misuse these computer programs and get a wrong result out. But there's no reason why an architecture school can't run, you know, a brief course on fractals, and here are the software, and here's how to use it appropriately. And it really isn't that hard. As you know, architects are very bright people, and, you know, so it's easy to apply these programs. It would just take a little course about what not to do, what to do, and then you're off, and you have this great career where whatever design you do, you can put it through these programs and you'll know. That's what's so exciting about this era that we're in. It's all so obvious and so easy, and we've just got to walk down this road and do it.
Well, Richard, when enrollment opens, please.
Yeah, I think we should definitely continue this conversation. We're both very willing students.
yeah, because I think, you know, it's when it becomes that easy. It's kind of like you know, energy modeling, and when you're designing a building, you're trying to understand what the impacts of various decisions on the carbon intensity. And unless you have a tool that lets you see it and iterate with it, it's not really useful to you as a metric to design with. But as soon as you have something that allows for iterative design, you know, you design 3 versions of an ornament, you run it through and you say, okay, this one's dimension 1.2, this one's 1.4, this one's crazy, it's 1.9. What am I actually doing here? What's relevant to the program?
Right, and then you can run it through other technologies that we talked about, like eye tracking and EEG, and you get so much feedback from all these things.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in our process, we didn't do it deliberately, but, you know, it was a 24-hour process. So the Austrians would go away and do the designs, pass them back to us in Oregon. We would analyze them, send our feedback to the Austrians. And so the design crew was literally going 24 hours a day. One advantage of time zones, there's not many.
Continuous loop. Well, yeah, Richard, we'll have to stay in touch about that, because it's something that I think both in practice and in education is something I find very fascinating. You know, we've been pre-pandemic, we actually were going to have iMotions, the company that Ann Sussman mentioned, come visit us at Centerbrook Architects and talk about eye tracking and EEG and their suite of software and ways that architects might be able to implement it. I think it's one of many tools.
Right.
But the problem for me has always been, how do you interpret that data? You get huge amount of data on people, how they're stimulated by your design, but then how do you actually guide someone toward, here's what I actually should do?
Right. I guess too, that's the importance of having collaborations too with people who are actually experts in fields. You don't have to do everything yourself.
I was just going to say exactly that. There's so much fun in a collaboration, and it's so rewarding that it's always worked out better for me than to try and acquire all the skills myself.
Yeah. We have a question from Brian S. You want to?
Sure. Okay. First of all, thank you for this seminar this evening and the insights you all have provided, referencing an earlier comment about how minimalism has accelerated the amount of stress in society due to lack of aesthetically appealing structures. Could it be theorized that the constant mix of different architectural styles in a city contributes to a fast-paced feel that is synonymous with city life? For example, you have LA with various styles side by side, such as arts and crafts, right next to modernism and other designs.
Yeah, the answer is no. LA stinks because you maybe have one arts and crafts building, and then you have 10 really horrible, nondescript buildings. There's not enough variety. Whereas you go to a European city and you have 15th century buildings next to very nice 19th century building, and maybe, one more contemporary building. So the density is there and the variety is there. And also LA is not a pedestrian city. You cannot appreciate architecture, design, unless you're a pedestrian. Driving around in a car is a totally different perceptive level. If you lose the fractals, you lose the ornamentation, because the speed really engages the brain in a very, very different way. And LA is a driving city. So I don't agree with that.
Could fractals be designed to be experienced from a car or an airplane?
Yeah, that's.
Well,
repeat that. You broke up.
You said that we can't experience fractals well in a car, but I'm saying, what if you designed fractals so they were experienceable from a moving vehicle like a car or airplane?
Oh yeah, it's very easy. Yeah, just drop all the smaller scales.
Yeah.
And then you can experience the fractal from a car or from an airplane. But then when you're a real human being, a pedestrian, it is an alien environment. That's what has happened to Los Angeles.
It does make me feel like maybe we need to redesign our freeways so that they have fractals to be right at the car scale, and then when you get off the off-ramp,
switch over to the
human scale.
Of course you do. And I have to leave for dinner.
All right.
It's getting pretty late on our side.
Well, thanks for sticking with us. We still have 22 brave souls who hung out with us for 2.5 hours. So thank you to everyone.
So much. It was incredible, truly.
Yeah, Richard and Nikos, I will definitely, we will both be in touch with you.
Yeah.
For sure. We have a lot of, I think, interest in common, and
Sure.
We're excited too to post this lecture online and hopefully continue the conversation.
Maybe even some collaborations in the near future.
Bye, everybody.
All right, bye.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it immensely. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.
Thank you.
Such a cool look. Saved.